Hello and welcome to Scientific American Live. My name is Kate Wong and I'm a senior editor covering evolution and ecology here at Scientific American. I'm really delighted to be hosting today's discussion on bird migration and song. I've spent most of my career writing about prehistory, so human origins, dinosaurs, stuff like that. But recently I've become completely obsessed with birds. Like many people, I started bird watching a couple of years ago when I was stuck at home because of the pandemic, and I hadn't really paid much attention to my backyard birds before then. But suddenly I was spending all of my free time observing them, and it's been the ultimate form of escapism for me, watching the dramas of their lives unfold while mine has kind of been on hold. For those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, May is a particularly exciting month for bird watching because many migratory species are making their way north from their wintering grounds, and they're singing as they set up their territories and search for mates. So the phenomena we're talking about today, migration and song, are things many of us can observe happening around us right now. We have two experts here with us today who have recently written about their research for Scientific American. Peter Hore is a chemist at the University of Oxford. He works on the biophysical chemistry of electron and nuclear spins and their effects on processes such as the mechanisms of animal magnetoreception. And Adam Fishbein is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, San Diego. He studies the cognitive and neural bases of animal social interactions. It's great to have everyone here for this event. Before we get into the discussion, we have a couple of quick housekeeping items. We're going to have a question and answer session after we hear from our speakers. So if at any time during the event you have questions, please drop them into the questions panel and we'll address them at the end. You can join today's event with your computer audio or by calling in on the phone. To switch between the two, just click on the circle next to your preferred audio option. If at any point you're having any technical difficulties, please contact the organizers through the chat tool. So let's meet our experts. Peter, can you tell us a little bit about your research generally and how you came to study bird migration as a chemist?
Yes, thanks, Kate. So I've been studying a form of molecule called radicals for basically the whole of my academic life, going back to my time as a graduate student in Oxford. So radicals are molecules that contain an odd number of electrons. So most molecules, stable molecules, have even numbers of electrons. But if you take an electron out of a molecule like that, or add an electron to it, then of course you get an odd number of electrons. And quite often that makes the molecule very reactive and unstable and therefore short-lived. So I've been studying these radicals now for almost 40 years. And there's a property of radicals and the odd electron that they contain that makes them unique. And that is magnetism. So the electron is magnetic. It behaves like a microscopic magnet. And the molecules that have even numbers of electrons have the electrons paired up. So it's like a pair of bar magnets with North Pole to South Pole, so that the magnetic moments cancel for most molecules. But of course, if you have an odd number of electrons, then you can't get complete cancellation. So radicals are magnetic because of the properties of the electron. And that leads to some very interesting chemical and physical properties of the reactions, the chemical transformations of radicals. So I've been using those magnetic properties over the years to study a number of things, the actual chemical reactions they undergo, but also other things like photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert solar energy into chemical energy. And also I've used radicals to study the structures of biological molecules like proteins. So the relevance of all of this to bird migration started about 15 years ago with the possibility that birds used radicals to detect the direction of the Earth's magnetic field and to use it to help them navigate as they fly thousands of kilometers in many cases between their wintering grounds and their breeding grounds.
Fantastic. I can't wait to hear more when we delve deeper into the discussion. So for our next expert, Adam, can you tell us about your work and how you came to study birdsong? I know you work on a number of different organisms, so tell us how you got into birds.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So I'm generally interested in how non-human animals communicate and think about the world and how they compare to humans. And I seriously got into the topic when I was an undergraduate at University of Maryland. And at that point, I was kind of interested in linguistics and philosophy. I took a seminar called Language and Mind. And in that class, I learned for the first time how amazing some species of birds are in terms of their vocal learning abilities, and how even at the level of genes, these birds are more similar to humans than our closer relatives like chimpanzees are to humans. And when I went back for my graduate school studies, I started approaching birds thinking that they would have like advanced grammatical abilities similar to humans. I started to do tests that would probe those kind of abilities. But I ended up finding that the birds seemed to be actually listening to song much differently than we would expect. So even simple changes in sequences that we would think would be obvious to the birds, they had difficulty hearing them. So to me, that gives hints about how communication is different between birds and humans, and how we can think about how language involved in humans, what abilities underlie that, and why they might have arose in humans and not in other species like birds.
So interesting. Thank you. So we're going to dive into migration now. And just to warm up a little bit, we have a quiz for everyone in the audience on this topic. If we can pull up the quiz, that would be great. So our question is, which of these species makes the longest migration? Is it A, the palm warbler, B, the Arctic tern, C, European robin, or D, Western tanager? Let us know what you think in the poll. And we'll wait a little bit while folks have a chance to register their answers. Okay, we're getting there. Folks are logging their answers. Couple more seconds and we'll have the results and an answer for you. Okay, we're closing the poll. Okay, so 12% of you said palm warbler, 63% said Arctic tern, 14% European robin, and the last one, 11%, we've got a little typo there, that should have been Western tanager, and 11% of you chose that one, and the majority is correct. It's the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern winters in the Antarctic and breeds in the Arctic, so it travels nearly 25,000 miles during migration, which is just astounding. Okay, so now we're going to talk with Peter, our expert on migration. And Peter, you know, one of the things that you talked about in your article, your recent article for Scientific American, was about how, you know, migratory birds have at least 3 different compasses that we know of that they can use their way to find their way to their breeding and wintering grounds. And one of them allows them to orient based on the position of the sun in the sky. Another's based on patterns of the stars in the night sky, and the third is based on Earth's magnetic field. So you gave us a little bit of a hint of that in your initial remarks, and that is the magnetic field compass is the one we're going to focus on today. So people have been trying to find out for a while how birds use the magnetic field to navigate. Can you tell us, it's a really interesting history, can you kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So the first suggestion that birds might use the Earth's magnetic field came in the middle of the 19th century. It was Alexander von Middendorf, working in Russia, who was fascinated by migratory birds, as I'm sure many of us are, and how they managed to find their way over these enormous distances, traveling from Siberia, in some cases, all the way to sub-Saharan Africa, although it probably wasn't known exactly where they were going at that time. And he guessed or proposed that they might use the Earth's magnetic field. He referred to migratory birds as the sailors of the skies. Clearly wondered whether, like human sailors, they had a kind of compass that would allow them to detect the Earth's magnetic field. And the advantage of that for navigation is that it's always there. So they may not be able to see the sun or the stars, depending on the weather and the time of day, but the Earth's magnetic field is always present. And he wondered whether they might be able to use it to get a sense of direction. So that was the middle of the 19th century, and nothing really much happened in terms of the mechanism of this compass until the 1960s. And that's when Friedrich Merkel and Wolfgang Wiltschko, studying European robins in Germany, did an experiment that really convinced people that migratory songbirds do have a magnetic compass. So their experiment used a behavior which has become known as migratory restlessness. So this dates back to the 18th century. So at that time, there were people who kept wild birds in cages. And they noticed that some of these birds in the spring and the autumn became very agitated. They were very active at night, which was unusual. They started to put on weight, and they were clearly anxious, or so it seemed to the observers, about something or other. They were hopping around a lot. And this, it turns out, coincided with members of the same species in the wild starting to migrate. And so this behavior, spontaneous behavior, provides a very convenient tool for scientists to investigate magnetic orientation. And what Merkel and Wiltschko did was to put European robins into a cage under conditions where they had no other sense of direction except the magnetic field that they were experiencing. And surrounding this cage were loops of wire, coils, copper wire, through which currents, electric currents, could be passed. And the electrons moving in the coils produced magnetic fields. And if you control those currents and the geometry of the coils very carefully, then the net result is a rotation of the direction of the Earth's magnetic field that the birds experience. And what they found was that when they rotated the magnetic field, say by 120 degrees clockwise, then the birds would try to hop in a different direction, 120 degrees rotated. And it's since been established that the direction in which the birds jump in their cages during the migratory season in their attempt to escape is the direction in which they would fly if you release them. So it's a very convenient assay for magnetic orientation. And so those experiments done in the 1960s have now been repeated in many, many laboratories and in the wild using these orientation cages with coils. So there's no doubt the birds do have a magnetic compass. And we're just starting now to understand the mechanism of that compass, just how that works.
And is it all birds that we think have this magnetic compass, or a particular subset of them? I mean, you know, some birds migrate, as we saw in our poll, really long distances. Others are kind of hang out in the same general area year round, and then different groups of birds, you know, have different abilities and habits. So, what's your sense of how extensive this ability is?
Well, we're not sure. I mean, it is clear that migratory songbirds Small birds, typically less than 25 grams, do have magnetic compass. Every migratory songbird species that has been tested, and there have been about 20 of them in these orientation cages, do show magnetic orientation. The larger birds, it's not quite so clear. It's much more difficult to put a swan or a goose into an orientation cage. You need rather large coils of wire to manipulate the magnetic field, but many people believe that all birds do have this ability. Even, for example, domestic chicken, which these days don't fly anywhere much. That's not quite so clear. That's a bit controversial, but it could be all birds.
Fascinating. So, I mean, recently you and your colleagues, so you wrote the article in Scientific American with your colleague Henrik Moritzen, and I know other groups have been working on this problem as well. You've made some really exciting headway in identifying a possible mechanism by which the compass works. So can you tell us a little bit about that? I think we're also going to show folks a slide that'll kind of help you visualize what Peter's talking about, because it gets pretty detailed and fascinating.
Yes, so we think that the way in which birds can detect the direction of the Earth's magnetic field involves magnetically sensitive chemical reactions. As I said earlier, reactions that have as short-lived intermediates pairs of radicals, not just one, but two. Now, at first sight, that is a ridiculous suggestion because Earth's magnetic field is not very strong and biological tissue is not very magnetic. So if you do a little back of the envelope calculation of the energy with which the Earth's magnetic field interacts with a radical, with its unpaired electron, then you rapidly come to the conclusion that that interaction energy is about 1 million times too small to affect any of the chemical reactions you could imagine a radical undergoing. So that's a valid argument for almost every chemical reaction, but radical pairs, as I said earlier, have some very strange properties, which makes them exceedingly sensitive to very weak magnetic interactions. Now, maybe I can give you a little analogy that might help here. So it's not perfect, but imagine this wooden box as a heavy stone block. And so a chemical reaction would be a bit like tipping this block over. From here, that would require quite a lot of energy. You'd have to raise the center of gravity of the block a bit. And so imagining that a chemical reaction could affect, that a magnetic field could affect the block tipping over, that would be like imagining a fly bumping against the side of the block was going to affect the rate at which it tipped over. That's simply not going to happen. The fly doesn't impart enough energy. But if you balance this block like this, very difficult to balance it, of course, that's a highly unstable state just on its edge. So you put in the energy necessary to raise the center of gravity a bit. Now the fly bumping into one side of it could make all the difference to whether it fell one way or the other. So the moral of that rather imperfect analogy is that tiny, tiny amounts of energy, if applied to very high energy non-equilibrium states like the balancing block, those tiny amounts of energy can have profound effects. And that's essentially how this radical pair mechanism works. And it's a real mechanism. It was discovered in the 1970s, and there are now hundreds of examples of free radical reactions that have been studied in the laboratory, which are known to respond to magnetic fields. So the big question is, could this be sensitive enough to be a compass for the birds? And if so, what are the molecules? What's the chemistry that's doing this? So we got into this about 15 years ago in Oxford, when there was a suggestion that a protein called Cryptochrome is the molecule in which this chemistry takes place. Now, first of all, the bird's compass is an unusual one. It's not like the magnetic compass needles that we all used to use when we were hiking before we had GPS and magnetometers in our phones. It's unusual in two respects, at least, one of which is it's light dependent. So if you test the birds in the orientation cages under blue or green light, then they can orient magnetically perfectly well. If you test them under red or yellow light or total darkness, then they jump in random directions and they're longer oriented. So any mechanism that you would propose has to be light dependent. And secondly, it's an unusual compass because it's what's known as an inclination compass. So a compass needle, as a sailor might use, is what's known as a polarity compass. So that means the compass needle just always points north. Well, the birds can't distinguish north from south, but what they can do with their compass is to distinguish the direction towards the magnetic pole or the magnetic equator. So that's a strange sort of compass, very different from the behavior of a compass needle. And the radical pair mechanism, so-called, could explain both of those properties. So with reference to the slide you're looking at now, the crucial thing in the middle is known as a radical pair. So this is the blue and red circles with little arrows through them. And the arrows represent the magnetic moments of the electrons in those two radicals, the blue and the red one. And the magnetic moment arises from a quantum mechanical property of the electron called spin, or to give it its full name, spin angular momentum. So this radical pair mechanism is a fundamentally quantum mechanical effect. Now, there are two sorts of radical pairs. They can have those two spins, the arrows, either pointing in the same direction, and we call that a triplet state, or in opposite directions, and that's a singlet state. And it's the interconversion of these two, which is a cyclic process. It goes round and round, typically millions of times per second. It's that process that can be sensitive to very weak magnetic fields. And so all you need, in principle, for this to be a magnetic compass is that the singlet and triplet states have different chemistry. Shown in this diagram, the triplet state is reacting towards the right to form a signaling state of the protein, and the singlet state is going back to what's known as the ground state. So anyway, to cut a long story short, we think this is happening inside a protein called cryptochrome. Now, birds have 6 different cryptochromes. We know that the magnetic sensor is in the bird's eyes, in their retinas, which of course is the ideal place for a light-dependent process. So I said that the birds need blue or green light. Well, that gets into the eye, to the retina, where we know there are cryptochromes inside cells in the retina, specifically in photoreceptor cells, which normally are used just for vision. But they may also, or some of them may also be used for magnetic sensing. So when we started experimental work on this, we needed to choose which of the 6 bird cryptochromes we should focus on. And we chose the one called 4A for a variety of reasons, one of which was that, unlike some of the others, it absorbed light of the right wavelength. And so in that way could form radical pairs that might be magnetically sensitive. Then, in order to study that protein, we needed large quantities of the purified protein, the biological molecule. And that took a while to achieve, but eventually that was solved by Jingjing Xu, who is a graduate student of my collaborator, Henrik Mauritzen, in Germany. And she was able, using bacterial cell cultures, to produce large amounts of highly pure Cryptochrome 4a from the European robin, a migratory bird. And we've been studying this in the laboratory as a purified protein. And we've been able to show that when you shine blue light on it, you form radical pairs, and the reactions of those pairs of radicals do respond to magnetic fields. So it looks like this molecule has at least some of the right properties to be a magnetic sensor.
That's incredible detective work. And it just makes me wonder, because this is the kind of thing that, it's taken decades to get to the point where you have a hypothesis like this that is supported by some really intriguing evidence. But how certain are you that this Cryptochrome is the one? And how did you even land on this Cryptochrome in the first place as a possible contender for being the underlying mechanism here?
Yeah, we're not certain it's Cryptochrome, but there's no other candidate at the moment. So it was suggested 22 years ago that Cryptochrome might be the right molecule, and there's been no other serious suggestion since. So it's the only known photoreceptor molecule in vertebrates which forms radical pairs when it absorbs light. Now, that doesn't mean it's the right molecule. There may be unknown photoreceptors in birds, but it does seem, as a result of a number of clever experiments done in a variety of laboratories, that it does seem to have the right kind of properties. So how did we come across it in the first place? Well, the Cryptochromes were only discovered during the 1990s in plants. And by the end of the 1990s, enough was known about the photochemistry of plant cryptochromes for a man called Klaus Schulten working in Illinois to suggest that this might be a suitable molecule. So he was the one originally in 1978 who suggested that the mechanism of the magnetic compass might be radical pairs. And we all read that paper, those of us working on radical pairs at the time, and were fascinated by it, but it was so abstract that nobody got really interested in it. But as soon as he suggested in the year 2000 this particular molecule, then suddenly that focused our minds, both the physical scientists like myself and the biologists like my collaborator, Henrik Lauritsen. And so that's how we got started on Cryptochrome. And yeah, one of the challenges, you're quite right, is now to prove convincingly to the skeptics that this is the right molecule, if indeed it is.
Are there a lot of skeptics?
Oh, there are skeptics, sure, yeah. I'm not convinced it's right. I think that there's so many things we don't know about it that we need to know before we can be sure, which is, of course, part of the fascination working in this area. Lots of interesting questions to investigate.
So what are the next steps? Like, what are the sort of burning questions that you need to tackle to further test your hypothesis about Cryptochrome?
Okay, well, so we know that the purified proteins show responses to magnetic fields. We need to show that in ideally in a living bird, so, or at least in a more biological environment. So the molecules may behave differently inside cells, and that might make the cryptochromes more sensitive to magnetic fields than they are when they're purified, because inside a cell they'll be interacting with all sorts of other molecules, which they need to do anyway for the purposes of signaling. So of course it's not enough just to sense the direction of the magnetic field. You need to pass that information on and somehow or other generate nerve impulses that will go to the brain, where that information can be integrated with directional cues from other sensors. So we don't know much about how the signal is transduced. We're beginning to learn about what the interaction partners are for cryptochromes inside the cells. And then we'll know more about whether this mechanism could be sensitive enough. I've said that it's light dependent. These birds, the songbirds, almost all of them fly at night. And there's not much light then. If it's the right mechanism, then there must be enough under starlight. And so we need to work out what the factors are that control the sensitivity and allow this to work at night. So those are some of the things that we need to solve in the next few years.
You've got your work cut out for you. You know, it's obviously just a sort of intrinsically interesting question to study, but are there other sort of practical reasons for wanting to figure out, you know, how it is exactly that birds use the magnetic field to orient?
Yes, so one possibility is that we could use what we learn from studying the birds and the cryptochromes to design better magnetic sensing devices. So it's already clear that certain sorts of light-emitting diodes, resembling the ones in the display screens of our mobile phones, which are made entirely from organic molecules. So these semiconductors can show magnetic field effects, the physics of which are very similar to radical pairs. So if we can work out how all this works inside a bird's eye, we may be able to develop a technology of magnetic sensing devices for human use. And one can imagine all sorts of different applications of that based on the same principles. And well, we wouldn't use proteins as the molecules there. We would get clever organic chemists to make designer molecules with the right magnetic and chemical properties to optimize the magnetic sensitivity. So I think that's one possibility. Another one is that the information we learn about how the birds navigate may help with conservation of rare bird species. So migratory birds, because they travel these huge distances, are much more affected by human activity than resident birds. So climate change and habitat destruction can be devastating for migratory songbirds. And the problem is that if you try to move them away from these damaged habitats to somewhere safer, less affected by human activity, very often, instinctively, they just find their way back. They're such good navigators. And so there is the possibility that if we can understand how this compass really works, maybe there would be some way of tricking the birds, fooling them so that they don't go back, but they stay in the better habitat. And so that's a possibility as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. We're going to have you stay in the meeting with us so that we can chat with you again during the Q&A. But for now, we're going to move on to talking about birdsong with Adam. So we're going to be looking at what birds start doing once they've migrated and reached their breeding grounds, which is sing. And to get us in the mood for this topic, we've got another quiz for you. We want you to guess which bird sings the following song. If we could have our audio. No, we'd like to know whether you think it's a northern cardinal, a tufted titmouse, an indigo bunting, or a common yellow throat. We'll give you a few seconds to submit your answer. I've been trying to learn the bird songs, and I just learned this one the other day. A few more seconds on this. Okay, and we're closing the poll. Okay, so 19% of you said northern cardinal, 26% went with tufted titmouse, 25% with indigo bunting, and 30% with common yellowthroat. And the correct answer is indigo bunting, which we are going to talk more about with Adam. So Adam, birds make lots of different vocalizations. Like I mentioned, I've been trying to learn a lot of them, but it's slow going. It's hard to learn. And I know you've been working on bird song specifically. So maybe let's start by talking about what you mean about bird song, and how we humans tend to think about it.
Yeah, thanks. So traditionally, song is defined as those long, complex learned vocalizations that birds make in order to, the main functions are to defend their territories and in courtship. So there's been a lot of biases in the way people talk about songs. So kind of focusing on male song in like North America and Europe, where it's mostly for courtship. So it's evolved to be more elaborate. So the female is impressed and will choose their mates based off of it. So that's in contrast to calls, which are usually these shorter vocalizations. They're usually unlearned, so they don't change over development. And they're kind of simpler in the way that we think about it. But these categories are really, there are categories that we impose on the vocalizations. So there's some species where the calls are kind of longer than the song. Like there's such variety among different species of songbirds. So some have what we would say are more simple songs. Other birds learn more songs and they string them together into longer songs. So for my work, though, I was interested in birdsong because of the way it's like, you can think of it as like notes or syllables that are strung together into these sequences. And so when you're thinking about how humans think about birdsong, we think of it as kind of like these melodies or short sentence-like structures. And it's like, it's really hard not to think of it that way. They're these really catchy little tunes that we can even like whistle along to, and that birds seem to often repeat over and over again, different species of songbirds. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, like when you're a lot of the sort of classic ways of learning birdsong, where they're broken down into these mnemonics, and something like a Carolina wren, we're told it's tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, or something like that. And so it kind of reinforces this idea that people have, we're just kind of conceiving of these songs as as music like we listen to, where the melody is really important and that it's acting kind of like language. And so it's going to be really interesting to hear more about what your research has turned up about all this. So researchers have been studying birdsong for like a few decades now, at least. And how did they sort of start thinking about the possibility that birds might be perceiving songs differently than we do?
Yeah. So scientists have been interested in birdsong for a really long time, way back to like Aristotle even wrote about birdsong and vocal learning among birds. It wasn't until maybe like the 1950s or 60s that people were starting to get into experiments about how birds hear song. So it's a little bit harder to study perception of song as opposed to how the song is produced, or if you analyze the qualities of song. So you could like record song, which that technology to do that started in the early 20th century, and then you can visualize song using what's called like a spectrogram, which you see an example down there. But in terms of asking how birds perceive song, it's a little harder. So you can do it in the field, in the wild, or in the lab. And in the field, the way that researchers started to do it was called like playback experiments. So people would record song onto audio tape, way back technologies, and then they would manipulate the song in different ways to see if that would affect how other birds would react to it. So do they still recognize it as a song of their species? Are females still attracted to the song? And then in the lab, you can do more controlled experiments where you can train birds to basically do a hearing test where they'll be asked to maybe categorize sounds. So they'll like push a button when they hear certain sounds. And if there's a sound in a different category, they know to not push the button. Or you can ask the birds to distinguish between a couple different sounds. So the technique that I would use in the lab is you would play a song or a sound over and over and over again, and then you change the sound, and the birds are trained to know that if they push another key, that means that they've heard a change and they get a food reward. So you can play games to probe what birds can hear differently, what sort of changes in song. And so if you go in the 70s, there were these classic experiments by a researcher named Stephen Emlen at Cornell. So he was doing playback experiments in the wild using the species named the indigo bunting. We just heard their song. And you might have noticed when you just listen to the song, like a key feature to us that strikes our ears are these paired syllables. So you see it's marked in the spectrogram down there, where you have what it sounds to us like that same syllable repeated twice, repeated twice, repeated twice. You can play games with the indigo bunting to see if that's an important feature. If you unpair the syllables, so if you move around the order of them, so they no longer occur in those doublets. So does that change the way the birds react to it? So do they still treat it as a member of their own species? And do they still react in the same way? So like if birds feel like their territory is encroached on, they'll start to approach the speaker and they'll start to make some of their calls in response to it. And in that work by Emlen, he showed that these paired syllables, that structure doesn't really seem to matter much for the birds. So when you unpair them, when you shuffle around those elements, the birds still react the same way. So that was one of the key studies showing that birds, they do seem to be hearing their song differently than how we would describe it. And then in the lab, I'd say one of the key studies was in the 80s and 90s. There's a researcher named Stu Hulse. So his lab at Johns Hopkins, they were focusing on starlings, and they were interested in how birds hear patterns of sounds that are transposed in pitch. So you can think of like the happy birthday tune. We recognize it as the same tune if it's played with like the low keys on the piano or the high keys. Sounds the same to us. So the question is, in non-human animals, do they still categorize sound sequences as the same, even if they're shifted up and down in pitch? And in these tests with the starlings, where they were asked to categorize the sequence of sound, and then they were probed with these sounds that were differed in pitch, same pattern, but different in the pitch, do the birds treat it as that same tune? And the starlings did not. So if they were to hear happy birthday shifted up in pitch, they would hear it as a completely different tune. So that shows you that the birds are listening to sound differently than we are, these sound sequences.
That's fascinating. So bring us up to speed with your work and how you've kind of advanced our understanding of how birds are listening to song, what they're paying attention to in song. If we could get the next slide, please.
Yeah, so my work in the lab, so my advisor is Bob Dooling is his name. He's like a longtime expert in how birds hear song. And the technique that he used to test, and that I then used as a grad student to test how birds hear the differences between sounds, is when you repeat the sound over and over again, and then you change the sound. And so we mostly focus on the zebrafinch, and they're the most commonly used species in the lab. They're these cute little Australian birds. They have these orange cheeks, and they have a song. The male sings just one song, sort of, that they repeat over and over again. And we were probing how they hear sequences within these motifs compared to the features of individual syllables. And through work with Bob and others in the lab, we have found that the birds are really good at hearing this aspect of song called fine structure, acoustic fine structure. So fine structure, you can think of song or sounds as at two levels: the envelope, which are these slow moving fluctuations in amplitude. You can think of it as the outline of the sound in the waveform at top, as opposed to the fine structure, which are those rapid fluctuations in frequency and amplitude. So if you zoom in at the bottom of that panel, you can see all these fluctuations there that you wouldn't be able to see really when you're just looking at the broad outline of the song. And so with zebra finches, what we would do is we would play a normal song motif in the background, repeating over and over and over again. And then we'd change either the sequence or the structure of the individual syllables. So we would temporarily reverse the syllable. And so that changes the fine structure. And that's something that is pretty hard for us to hear, but the birds are extremely good at hearing it. So they can hear even when it's a really short sound that's reversed. And you can even use synthesized sounds where the only difference is fine structure. And the birds are really good at hearing that. They can hear it well beyond our hearing capacities.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So how do birds, kind of make and hear these fine acoustic details that are, inaudible to us?
Yeah, so birds have a specialized organ for producing song called the Syrinx. So we produce our sounds using our larynx, our voice box. Birds also have a larynx, but they don't use it for producing sound. They actually use this specialized organ called the Syrinx. And the Syrinx is cool because it has like two tubes and from which sound can be produced. And songbirds can actually independently use each of those two tubes in the Syrinx. So, and they also have muscles to change the membranes within the Syrinx that can move much faster than any other muscle invertebrates, right? So they can voluntarily control these movements, so they can produce sounds that are fluctuating much faster than anything we could make. And they can make two sounds at one time, so they can independently control both sides of the Syrinx. So they're able to create those really rapid fluctuations in frequency and amplitude that are much harder for us to hear.
That's fascinating. So it's not that these sounds are produced incidentally. This is something that they can control.
Right.
What is essentially the fine structure of the song.
Right. So it's not, when can be noise that can be created when you vocalize, but we don't think that this fine structure is simply noise. No, they can voluntarily control it, so they can make these fine manipulations of song, which could be important in terms of like courtship. So when the female is listening, maybe they hear within the fine structure some important features which indicate that the male is, for instance, like really good at replicating whatever song it learned as a little bird. So that could be a sign that the bird has, they're very cognitively advanced, and they're able to control their muscles of the syrinx in a way that gives a sign that their overall quality is really good.
That's amazing. And if I recall correctly, I was just reading this recently, you know, like some of the thrushes, when they're singing, they're actually singing a duet with themselves because they have that syrinx structure that allows them to produce two sounds at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you're right on that. So one of the species that I studied in my work was also the canaries. And
Mm.
canaries are thought to produce this special type of syllable that the females are really attracted to. You can call it the special syllable. It's been called like a sexy syllable. And this is a syllable that's created by both sides of the syrinx fluctuate rapidly, you know, back and forth using it. So, and a male's ability to do that can indicate their fitness, right? So a male that has more of these special sexy syllables is more attractive to the females.
And their ears are a little bit different from our ears too, right? They
Right.
have hearing structures to pick up on these special sounds, sexy syllables that they're making.
Yeah, so there are some basic differences in the inner ear, the sensory organ used to detect sounds. So we have, you know, it's called a cochlea because it's, you know, it's in a little snail shape. The inner ear, which has the hair cells that detect sound. Birds also have an inner ear organ with hair cells, but theirs is slightly curved rather than coiled up like the cochlea, and it's shorter, right? So you can think of it as like the way that sound is like tickling the sensory organ is a little different among birds and humans. There are many ways in which birds and humans actually, you know, hear similarly. So we can hear differences in pitch about the same. We can hear gaps in sounds about the same, differences in amplitude. So it's not to say that the birds are hearing sound completely different than us, but especially when it comes to their communication signals, the evidence is showing that they are really keying into different features of their song than we are when we hear it.
Neat. And I remember, I just want to get this in because it was a neat little aside that you mentioned to me when we were working on editing the article and we weren't able to get it into the story. But I think you mentioned that, you know, whereas humans, you know, are those little hair cells kind of deteriorate as we age, which contributes to hearing loss, that birds, those cells never deteriorate, so their hearing, in theory anyway, is pretty great throughout life.
Yeah, so birds really they don't go deaf, right? So they have hair cells when they're damaged, they can grow them back, which we cannot. So it's you can that shows you maybe you know how important hearing is for the birds. So if they lose it, they have a difficulty surviving.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Great. Well, I think we should probably turn to the audience Q&A now, because I hear from the organizers that we've got a lot of questions that have been rolling in. So how about to kick things off, let's start with Peter. You know, Peter, every once in a while, the Earth's magnetic field reverses so that magnetic north becomes magnetic south and vice versa. So if migratory birds rely on the magnetic field to navigate, do you have any idea of what can happen to them when the poles switch?
Well, the short answer is no, because we haven't experienced that happening, although we are overdue for another reversal. The last one was 700,000 years ago, and they don't happen regularly, but there will be another one, no doubt, coming up in the next 100,000 years. If it happened instantaneously, the birds would be none the wiser, because their inclination compass is not sensitive to exact reversal of the magnetic field. We know that from the orientation cage experiments. But of course, it doesn't happen instantly. It takes about 10,000 years for the magnetic field to reverse. And during that time, there can be regions on the Earth's surface where the magnetic field is very much weaker than it is at the moment. So we've no idea how the birds would cope with that, but of course they don't only use the magnetic field. They have their other sensors, the sun compass, the star compass, their sense of smell and recognizing landmarks. So the best guess, I think, is that those other sensors would simply take over during that period. And then many generations later, when the field settled down again, they would probably then revert to using the magnetic field as well as these other sensors.
I'm really relieved to hear you say that, because I just got a little bit stressed out thinking about that question. Adam, if it sounds like, these studies of how birds perceive birdsong have been carried out in like a handful of species, but there are thousands of species of birds and each one has their own vocal repertoire. So do you expect that what you and your colleagues have been finding out about perception of birdsong applies to all birds, or a sort of subset of them? And how would you kind of test that going forward?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because there are so many species of birds, especially species of songbirds, and they differ in the song itself. So some birds have more complex songs than others, and we have, there is evidence already that some birds are better at hearing sequence changes than others. So starlings are better; they can detect some changes in sequence, though not those transposed pitch patterns, as we talked about. There are, so in my work, we use parakeets as well, and the parakeets themselves are better at hearing these sequence changes than the zebra finches. But they do have these changes in sequence that they cannot hear, things that we can hear easily. So I do think that in general, birds are, I would suggest, are hearing song in a different way than we hear. And that this shows this difference in the communication system between humans, our language, and what birds do.
Cool. So actually there are a couple questions that have come in about pollution of various types from human activity. And so actually it would be great to hear from both of you on how it might be affecting, in Peter's case is could light pollution be disrupting the magnetic compass mechanism? And then Adam, if you could address whether sound pollution could be affecting the bird's ability to detect the fine structure. So we'll start with you, Peter.
Yes, I'm sure light pollution at night can be a very serious factor for the night migratory birds. And for that reason, they may avoid flying over big cities. I think, interestingly, another source of pollution is electromagnetic noise generated by electrical equipment. And we know from the orientation cage experiments that birds can be prevented from using their magnetic compass if you superimpose on the Earth's magnetic field a very, very weak time-dependent magnetic field that fluctuates a few million times per second. So the kind of frequencies emitted by AM radio masts, for example. So we're not sure whether this disorientation observed in the orientation cages could also happen in the wild. But that's a possibility, that human activity polluting the skies with electromagnetic noise could upset the migratory birds.
Neat.
Yeah, and for song overall, like environmental noise is a concern, of course, because of how important song is for birds in terms of breeding. And if they can't hear each other's songs, then that's going to disrupt their activities. And when you think about fine structure, though, it's even more sensitive to the effects of noise. So these rapid fluctuations at this millisecond time scale can easily be disrupted by the surrounding noise or buildings around if the song is bouncing off of buildings. So it's really not known how noise might be affecting the ability of fine structure to convey the messages that are important in it.
Something for further investigation.
Yeah.
Peter, we have a question here about whether, birds with maybe only one functioning eye or birds that are blind, would you expect that to impact their ability to use the magnetic field to navigate?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some people believe that birds have a magnetic compass sensor only in one eye. Now, the evidence seems to argue against that, but it's not entirely clear. I mean, it would seem entirely sensible for evolution to evolve magnetic sensors in both eyes, so that it's not a disaster if the birds go blind in one eye because of damage. I think if they're blind, then they're going to die pretty quickly, whether they're migratory or not. But the evidence is that the sensors are in both eyes, and so I suppose if one is damaged, then the other should still function.
Great. And Adam, here's one for you. When birds learn song, is it through mimicry, or are they imitating their parents? Are the parents like actively teaching them? Is it just are they sort of born knowing how to do this? How does that all work, and how do you think that might relate to the fine structure element of a song in particular?
Yeah, so learning in terms of vocal production is present in songbirds, in hummingbirds, and in parrots. So other groups of birds, which is many, many birds, aren't thought of as vocal learners. So like chickens aren't thought of as vocal learners, pigeons aren't vocal learners, etc. And so when birds are learning song, some birds are more like mimicry, where they can actually take any song and replicate it. So like mockingbirds are able to do a bunch of different songs. There's the lyrebird, superb lyrebird. You may have seen like the video, and there's one of the David Attenborough documentaries where the lyrebird can even mimic like a camera noise, right? So pretty amazing mimicry. But many species of birds, they're able to learn song basically within the parameters of their natural species vocalization. If they don't get input from their parents or from other birds, or even from like a tape recorded version, they will never develop normal song. They'll develop something that's like a babbling form of song, right? In terms of fine structure, so like the zebrafinch, for instance, they're the most popular species used for studies about vocal learning and production. So they learn not only the syllables themselves, but they do end up learning the sequence in which they occur from their parents. And both parents seem to be involved in this vocal learning process. There's recent studies showing that like the female, the mom, will like puff up if the bird is kind of screwing up in the song. So it can use the cues from both parents to know that they're achieving the correct song.
Oh, that's so interesting. These questions are so good. Peter, we have one audience member asking what you imagine the bird's perception of the magnetic field to look like. Are they picturing a map in their head? Are they, how do you think that that's working?
It's a good question. I wish I knew the answer. So it's possible that the birds form a visual impression. So they have the receptors in their retinas. The retina, of course, is responsible for vision. If the cryptochromes are in photoreceptor cells, as we think they are, then maybe they piggyback the visual transduction pathway. So the cone cells are used during the day for color vision and are largely inactive at night. And so it's possible these could be taken over by the magnetoreceptors at night, allowing the birds, in some sense, literally to see the Earth's magnetic field. Now, what they would see, who knows? I mean, it's you can speculate, but it is more or less science fiction. What we did do, more or less for fun, a couple of years ago, was to fly a drone over the Oxfordshire countryside, flying in a circle, and then superimpose on that video the magnetic field effect that we calculated based on the properties of the radicals in the cryptochrome. And so in that simulation, which admittedly was pure science fiction, we had a rather distinctive cross shape. And that cross shape was dead center in the field of vision of the bird when it was facing along the north-south axis. So it needs to be something like that. But the details, we really don't know. There's an awful lot of processing that happens in the eye before any information gets to the brain. So, yeah, it's a fascinating question. Yeah. I hope we'll be able to, or somebody will be able to shed light on that in the next few years.
Great. Adam, let's see, I just had this question pulled up. Do birds kind of, as far as you know, do they kind of adjust their song depending on the kind of environment that they're in? Is there any research that you're aware of that that would tell us anything about that?
So birds can adjust their song based off of other birds and sounds in the environment. That's one aspect maybe to address the question. So if there's a lot of noise within one pitch band, they can increase the pitch of their song a little bit or decrease the pitch of their song. Maybe the question is also about how song changes in different contexts, like social contexts or things like that. One aspect that's been pretty well studied is within zebra finches, they have what's called directed song versus undirected song. So if there is a female present, the song will be slightly different than if there's no female present and the male is just singing on his own. So it'll be kind of more cleanly structured. It's kind of like a better performance where it'll be kind of faster too, the way it's produced. So yeah, certainly context matters, but there's also like wide open questions in how birds are using song. So all the different contexts that a bird might find itself in, how might that affect the song that's produced and what might that say about the information carried in it?
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we've kind of reached time here. So I want to thank you both for this incredible, fascinating discussion on bird migration and song. And thank you to our audience for joining us today at Scientific American Live. If you could take a moment at the end to respond to the survey that you'll receive when the event ends, that would be great. Just let us know what other topics you'd like to see us cover on Scientific American Live. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.